Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vic Sido. So glad you're here to hear Don Pageler. As you know, the attack on the USS Liberty, it was an intelligence ship. And at this time, if they had intercepted messages from Israel, they would have known that Israel was going to capture the Golan Heights from Syria. And there were other things they might have found out about, like executing Egyptian soldiers instead of keeping them as prisoners. But what we're going to focus on here tonight is Don's personal story, because he had to go through some therapy and PTSD. He got a Purple Heart for being wounded, but he survived, and he'll tell you about that. They had a casualty rate of 70%, and this is among the highest casualty rates ever inflicted upon a U.S. naval vessel. President Lyndon Johnson recalled the planes that responded to the distress call. Can you believe that? Saying he didn't care if they all died. He didn't want to embarrass an ally. Okay, here about one of the biggest cover-ups in American history, American military history. 49 years later from the man that experienced it. Please give a warm welcome to Fellowship Hall for Don Pageler.
This presentation is not really about me, it's really about my ship. I will give you a little background on me so you can evaluate the story to your own liking. I grew up in a small town in Kansas by the name of Wamego, Kansas. I was an excellent athlete, very mediocre student. At the end of high school, my football coach said he could get me a scholarship in football and track at a small southeastern college in Kansas. I decided not to take that because I knew I wasn't emotionally prepared to work in college, and I figured the coaches would be laying a guilt trip on me about not making my grades, and I didn't want to go through that. So my mother and my aunt cooked up a scheme to send me to a private men's college in Missouri by the name of Westminster College. It happens to be a Presbyterian college. Its claim to fame was that Winston Churchill made his Iron Curtain speech there. That's where he dubbed the name Iron Curtain. After a year and a half, I flunked out. Knew the draft was going to be breathing down my neck. I had always kind of wanted to go to sea and join the Navy anyway. I had an uncle who was a communications officer in the Merchant Marines in World War II. So I went to Manhattan, Kansas, and talked to the Navy recruiter. Before I start into my Navy experience, et cetera, I want to give you a little background so that you can, and as I said, you can evaluate who you're hearing this story from. When I was debriefed after the attack, I was told, you've got the highest security clearance anybody can get in this country, go away, never talk about this to anybody, including your family. So for 20 years, I kept it all bottled up inside. In '85, I couldn't see the center stripe in the road anymore. I ended up in the doctor's office. He came back in white as a sheet, looked at me and said, I don't know why you're still on the face of this earth. You should have died a long time ago. He said, your blood pressure is 240 over 145. He said, it's been that way for a long time to do the damage to the eyes. Well, fortunately, what was happening, I was having strokes in the retina of my eyes instead of my heart or my brain, where it would have killed me, which is why he thought I should have been dead. After that breakdown, I ended up in a year and a half of very deep depression. Finally found out about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and called up the VA hospital in Long Beach and told them what I was looking for. And they said, well, we don't do anything with that here, which they didn't back in those days. And they said, but the closest vet center to you is 5 blocks north of Disneyland. So within a month of being able to go talk about what happened to us, both blood pressure numbers dropped 30 points, no change in medication, simply from not keeping it all bottled up inside. So that gives you an idea of what stress can do to your body. And As I said to a person earlier, I, for years, felt very guilty that I had been given a Purple Heart. I didn't think I was wounded badly enough. And so I ended up, after 3 years of therapy, realizing that, gee, in fact, I was a combat veteran. And so then I had some good computer skills. I had worked for Hughes Aircraft Company. We built communication satellites. And I had some decent computer skills, and I had taken some photos on the ship. And so I got to the point where I thought, I got to try and figure out what happened to us. So I put together this slideshow about 20 years ago or so. And as a result of the growth of the slideshow, I have eventually realized that my agenda in life is to see the true story of what happened to us put into history. I'm not into taking sides in the Middle East or anything else. So I entered boot camp in June of '66. I was in boot camp till the end of August. One of the stories about boot camp was that in Navy boot camp, you go through a very large battery of tests. When the tests are over, you get to put down 3 choices of what you'd like to do while you're in the Navy. So I went for my interview and sat down at this window, and this first class looked at me, and I opened up my folder, and he said, "Just a minute," and he went away and came back. He said, "Follow me," and we walked down this hallway, and he opened up this door to this room, and inside this room was a table with 2 chairs and a chief sitting at one of the chairs, and he said, "Go in here and talk to this man." So I went in there, and the chief said, "Well, how would you like to become a communications technician?" And I'll digress here for a second. In the 70s, they changed our name to crypto technician, which is a little more descriptive of what we really were. They were trying to be fairly deceptive about what our jobs were as far as intelligence goes. My brain was going 90 miles an hour, and I looked at the chief, and I thought, gee, it sure seems better than swabbing decks. So I said, I don't know, it doesn't sound too bad. Maybe I'll put it down for my 3rd choice. And he looked at me, and he said, "Son, the only way you can get in the Naval Security Group is if I recommend you, and the only way I'm going to recommend you is if you put it down for your 1st choice." And that's how I became a crypto technician with one arm twisted behind my back. So I left boot camp at the end of August, went to Pensacola, was in crypto school for 6 months in Pensacola. Reported to the Liberty. I went home on leave 1st of March, got married. Reported to the Liberty late March. We went to sea May the 2nd, and we were attacked June the 8th. So I was about as green as anybody on the ship. I was still trying to figure out how to put one foot in front of the other and keep from falling overboard. But anyway, so from there, I think, go back. I have, from the basic slideshow, I have added 5 slides. 3 of them are at the beginning and 2 of them are at the end. So I will start with, this picture was taken of my wife and I in Rochester, New York, at Ontario Beach State Park. It's a stone that was put up for us by the VFW in 2010. Part of why I'm doing what I'm doing is I lost 5 people in my life 4 years ago, including my wife unexpectedly to heart failure. One of the other people, besides my mother, was my best friend off the ship, who lived in Rochester and is the reason this stone is there. This stone says something that no other memorial to us has ever said, and that is that we are the most decorated ship in the United States Navy for one single action. You wouldn't compare us to a World War II ship that had been through multiple battles, but so you can see all the decorations listed on the stone. Now, the other slide that I added was I had given this presentation for years, and most of it was engrossed in the detail and the pictures I had taken and so on at the time, and I realized people really weren't getting a perspective of what the Liberty was all about. So I added this picture. I'm going to explain some basic parts about the ship so that later on you'll have some perspective. At the forward part of the ship, this raised area from there here is called the forecastle on a ship. And you're looking at the port side of the ship, and the forward forecastle had two gun mounts, a 50 caliber port gun mount and a 50 caliber starboard gun mount. Now, I'm going to be talking about the starboard gun mount, and also when you see the torpedo hole, that was on the other side of the ship too, on the starboard side of the ship. We were known in World War II as the SS Simons. We were converted to World War II Victory class ship. The Navy had taken two of these out of the merchant mothball fleet and converted them into intelligence ships. My understanding is that they spent between $40 and $50 million converting us to what I've been told was the most sophisticated listening platform in the world at the time. The torpedo struck where I worked in the intelligence spaces, and that was all the decks below the main deck in this area right here. The top deck were what we called our O-branchers. They sent all our information back to NSA. Deck stick below that was where I worked, collection guys, linguists. I happened to be a Morse code guy at the time. And in the bottom deck was the M-branchers, the guys who maintained our equipment. This area, later you'll see a lot about it. It's the bridge where Captain McGonigal was. The bridge is actually right here. This level right here is called the Flying Bridge, which is where Jim Ennis was at the beginning of the attack. He wrote the first book about the Liberty called Assault on the Liberty. Then back here is where our mess deck was, which you'll see a lot later. It's one level below the main deck. And right after it was where I slept, my sleeping compartment. Our crew was divided. 2/3 of the crew were crypto technicians. The other third were deck crew. The deck crew slept in the forward part of the ship, and we slept in the aft part of the ship. The other thing that I think is important to point out is there is a microwave antenna right here, but this large dish that looks like a ground station dish, this was 1967. Hughes, who I worked for, we put up our first satellite in the early 60s, but that first satellite was about the size of a footstool. So there really wasn't much traffic being carried by satellites in those days. This was called TRESCOM, and it stands for Terrestrial Relay Satellite System. And we used this to bounce our signal off the moon back to NSA headquarters in Cheltenham, Maryland. So I hope that gives you a basic perspective of what the Liberty was about and what the structure of it was. The Israelis say they came out and they didn't see a flag, which we not only were flying the flag, but during the middle of the attack, it got so shot up that our signalman, Joe Metters, put up our holiday colors, which is a 7 by 13 foot flag, which is a very large flag. I could be wrong, but if I remember right, this number 5, I think, was 30 feet tall. So how they could mistake us for anything but an American ship is a little unbelievable, too. We had run a general quarters drill at 1 o'clock. Captain McGonigal, I guess I should start with myself. I had just worked the midwatch from midnight to 8 in the morning, got off of my midwatch, went to the mess deck, ate breakfast, went into my sleeping compartment, and went to bed, or hit the rack, which in the Navy, which is a bed. And at 1 o'clock, Captain McGonigal ordered general quarters drill. Well, fortunately for me, my general quarters station happened to be on the mess decks right forward to where I was sleeping, so I got dressed and went onto the mess decks. I was assigned to Repair Party 3, and I was supposed to be in charge of a submergible pump. So about 1:35, 1:40, we secured from the drill. I was off duty, so I went up with some of the other guys to the fantail, the aft part of the ship, to smoke cigarettes and relax a little bit. I had just decided to go back down into my sleeping compartment and was halfway down the ladder when I heard all the metal hitting and the general quarters alarm sounded again, and that's when the attack started at 2 o'clock. So I just went on down the ladder, through my compartment, onto the mess deck. As I said, I was so green, I didn't have a clue what to do. Obviously, during an air attack, there was no need for a submergible pump. So somebody with experience grabbed me and said, go to the bridge and bring down wounded. So I and another fellow crawled up the superstructure, which you saw the bridge area, which was the safest way to get up there in the inside part of the ship. And just as we got up there, somebody threw open a hatch and had a guy on a stretcher, and we hauled the guy down below about 3 or 4 sets of ladders, which is a little difficult, carrying a guy on a stretcher down 3 or 4 sets of ladders. Navy ship ladders are very steep. And I have, as I told somebody in Arizona last month, for most of us, we usually think of our past like a movie. I mean, you don't remember every specific detail that went on every second, but you have a general idea of how you spent your time. For me, my memory of the attack is a lot like a bunch of pictures that I try to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. So out of the 25, 30 minutes of the air attack, I don't remember how many runs I made up and down to the bridge. When the Israeli fighters left us, we had over 820 rocket and cannon holes in the top side of the ship, and you'll see the rocket holes later. Not to mention over 3,000 machine gun hits. And then they came out with Navy torpedo boats, fired 5 torpedoes at us, and before that they came out with bombers and dropped napalm on us, so we were trying to fight the fires from the napalm while they were bringing out the torpedo boats. We left Norfolk on May 2nd. We got to our normal run was up and down the west coast of Africa. We got to Abidjan, which is the capital of the Ivory Coast, late that month. These are on the way down in the Atlantic on the top. Believe it or not, I once was skinny. That was me, 21 years old. The bottom pictures are when we hit Abidjan. Those are taken at a hotel called the Hotel Laval. We were supposed to have 4.5 days of Liberty. After a day and a half, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had taken direct control of the Liberty and ordered us to go into the Mediterranean because they knew things were heating up. The 6-day war hadn't started yet, but they knew that things were getting hot and heavy. So they ordered us to go to Rota, Spain, and said we would receive further orders once we got to Rota, Spain. So this is when we got to Rota. These did happen to be my camera, although the one on the bottom right, obviously I didn't take the picture because I'm in the picture. That is a photo that the Navy would not have been happy that I had. The reason being is Rota is a submarine base, and across the channel behind me is a subtender. But if you look right down in front of it, right there, is a nuclear fast attack submarine. And the Navy does not like having their nuke subs photographed. This many years later, I don't think anybody's going to come after me, but... So then we were told to head into the Mediterranean. We were going to be stationed between 12 and 15 miles off the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and We got there a couple of days before the attack, and we were trolling along at 5 knots. These pictures are taken before the attack. This is our executive officer, Phil Armstrong. He was an academy graduate. This is also Armstrong. And to his right is one of my crypto chiefs, Chief Smith. Both of them died during the attack. There is a school building in Pensacola where I was trained, named after Chief Smith now. These are 3 of our top officers sunbathing about 3 or 4 hours before we were attacked. This is Armstrong. In the back is Lieutenant Golden. Lieutenant Golden was what we called a Mustang officer, an LDO, limited duty officer, which means he was enlisted and then promoted into the officer ranks. George had 2 ships shot out from under him during World War II. So needless to say, after the Liberty, he became a very religious person. On the right is Captain McGonigal, who was just exactly twice my age. He was 42. In the morning, the Israelis had run between 9 and 13 reconnaissance missions on us in the morning. They even admit that they had us identified as a naval American intelligence ship on their control board in Haifa. But they said, well, at 8 o'clock on the shift change, somebody took the marker off the board because it was old information. So this was one of the recon planes earlier in the morning. This is the first attack aircraft coming in at us at 2 o'clock. Then down below, this picture of me with 2 of the 820 rocket holes. This is Captain McGonigal on the bridge looking at a rocket hole. Ensign Lucas with two of the rocket holes. This picture is taken in a similar place to the one of me. His name's Herb Petum, another one of my the CTs. Herb lives in Missouri now. Again, more rocket holes. In the background, you can see the Trescom antenna. Reason I don't have any trouble talking about the Trescom antenna is I got on the web about a year ago, and it's all over the web. I mean, it's obviously declassified. But the rest of this is all still just damage. Here I was at the aft end of the ship looking forward. So this is the starboard side of the bridge with 3 rocket holes. Down here is where our whaleboat, our captain's gig, hung. It burnt from fire. This picture kind of shows the overall part of the ship, and it shows how full of holes we were. That picture actually ended up in Life magazine in the July edition. However, the whole spread of the July edition was about what the Israelis were doing with the 6-day war. The front cover had an Israeli army guy holding an AK-47. It said very little about what happened to us. Again, more rocket holes. So as you saw in that beginning slide, this is the bridge area up here. That's the flying bridge. Down here, this is one of our antenna mounts, but there's another picture that has more of them, and I'll talk to that. Where this dark is up here, looks like it might possibly be burnt. It's actually paint that's been chipped off by machine gun fire. So I took these pictures, the first one on the left, looking forward at the forecastle. Now, Jim Ennis, who wrote Assault on the Liberty, said he looked forward and saw one of our gunner's mates get hit by a rocket, and he flew in the air like a rag doll end over end. Well, I'm sure that what he was talking about was this forward starboard gun mount, and Alexander Thompson happened to be our third-class gunner's mate who was in that mount. And what's left of Thompson, you see the blood of Thompson running down this bulkhead here. The Israelis have tried to say we fired back at them, and in fact, we probably did fire less than 10 rounds. One of my shipmates who died a few years ago lived in Nebraska. His name was Dale Larkin. Said that after Thompson was blown out of the gun mount, McGonigal sent him forward, and he went up there. He said he got in the gun mount, and he said the belt had been broken, and only about 2 or 3 rounds had been fired. He said he rethreaded the belt, tried to fire the gun, and he said he got off a few rounds and the gun jammed. So nobody really got off that many rounds. Then I went up onto the forecastle, like over in this area on the port side, looking into that gun mount. And these are pictures taken the following day. We didn't see any Americans till the following day, and I'll talk about that later. But this is the USS Davis is sailing alongside of us. To give you an idea of how undermanned we were, in the background here, that is the Davis's anti-aircraft gun. Down here is our little 50 caliber pea shooter. So we didn't have, pardon the expression, snowball chances in hell of being able to fight off fighter jets. These are cabin photos with rocket holes. This is Captain McGonigal right there. There's a rocket hole underneath the porthole. This picture here is in Lieutenant Golden's cabin looking out of the rocket hole in his cabin. This is our main mast. It had a rocket hole in it, although it's kind of hard to see in the slide. That's the forward port gun mount opposite of where Thompson was. These are our antenna mounts. The Israelis were using heat-sinking missiles. So they immediately took out all our antennas because antennas radiate a lot of heat. And fortunately, we had one antenna that was down for repairs and wasn't emitting any heat, so their rockets didn't destroy that one. One of my shipmates who I'd become close to, especially after my wife died, every time I would come up to see Linda, I would stop and stay in Visalia, and Terry lived in Visalia. Unfortunately, Terry died a year and a half ago of a heart attack. Terry went out and strung a line from the transmitting shack out to the antenna that hadn't been damaged, and that's how we got our distress call out at 2:05. So 5 years ago, Terry was given the Silver Star because nobody really had realized what he had done. Copy of his Silver Star is back on the table. His Silver Star is the first document that says that it was the Israelis that attacked us. My presidential unit citation, Captain McGonigal's Medal of Honor, all say we were attacked by foreign jet aircraft and torpedo boats. Never mentions the Israelis. Fortunately, I guess the pro-Israeli people in this country were asleep at the switch when they did Terry's Silver Star, and so they got it in there that it was the Israelis that attacked us. I have been working with a fellow in Visalia. We're trying to get June 8th named USS by the city and county of Tulare to name it USS Liberty and Terry Halbardier Remembrance Day. But you can see how they knew exactly what they were going after. This is more damage, but the interesting thing about this is on the port side, the side that you were looking at that beginning photo. And this rocket came in the starboard side of the ship, the other side of the ship, passed clear through the ship and came out on this side. The reason you can tell that is you see the metal is going out. So as I said earlier, after all the rocket damage and everything, they came out with bombers and dropped napalm on us. And while we were trying to fight the fires from the napalm, they brought out 3 Navy torpedo boats and fired 5 torpedoes at us. 2 things that I would like to mention about this slide. One is this is 171. Now it's 174. We had 3 guys apply for and receive Purple Hearts since that time. It takes a certain amount of documentation. They have to have people that can testify to the fact that they saw their wounds, etc. We had 1 doctor and 2 corpsmen for 208 guys that received Purple Hearts. So you can imagine what their job was like. As I said, then they came out with bombers and dropped napalm on us. This is from napalm damage. I took these photos starting here at the bottom left. That is an inflatable life raft. They're obviously not there. They all burnt. If you look here, this is where that rack attaches to the bulkhead, and you can see where the bulkhead's all charred from fire. Then I took a picture looking upward, and that's where that same attach point is. And above that is one of our midship gun mounts. And then I went up on the next deck and took a picture looking into the gun mount. This shows where the fire line stopped. This is all fire damage. Again, our Trescom antenna in the background. So we had most of the, well, let me talk about the top slide. That's Captain McGonigal and Lieutenant Painter. Lieutenant Painter, like me, got out of the Navy after 4 years. He became a Secret Service agent. For years, he lived in Fairfield over here and was assigned to the San Francisco Secret Service office. As I said, we had all the really badly wounded on the mess decks. This is a good place to pick up. After the air attack, I remember somebody, when they said, prepare for, when Captain McGonigal came on and said, prepare for torpedo attack, somebody said, throw yourself across the wounded. So we did that, and it was a good thing somebody had experience enough to say that, because when we took the torpedo, it was like a giant was on one side of the ship and just lifted it up. Being at the aft end of the ship, it just sounded like a thud to me. Lifted the ship up in the air, and then we just slowly sank back down in the water. But if somebody hadn't told us to do that, all those guys would have rolled off the floor onto the deck. So it was a good thing that we had some experience on there. This guy here has been in and out of a VA hospital all his life. He lives on Maui now. One of the few little levity points in the presentation is that guy was one of my crypto guys. His name was Glenn Bloxham. He lived in Colorado. He's dead now. If you take a look at his nose, not that I don't have one myself, but his nickname was Bullwinkle, for any of you that remember the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. And if you look right behind him is a guy with glasses on. I have a picture. Unfortunately, I didn't put it in the slideshow. Ken lives in Illinois. Ken was the next day was holding his helmet, his battle helmet, and it had 2 or 3 holes about this size in the side of his helmet. So why Ken's still alive, I don't think anybody understands. So again, I talked about 9 guys died topside from the air attack. When we took the torpedo hit, where I worked up forward, 25 guys died down where I worked. After we took the torpedo, well, the one other thing I remember during the torpedo attack was one of my shipmates was on his knees on the deck with his rosary beads saying goodbye to life. And then somebody said, take the submergible pump forward to the torpedoed spaces. And all I remember is I got up there just in time, and one of the officers was making the decision to close the hatch to make the ship watertight so we didn't sink. And the only thing I remember thinking is, man, I'm glad I'm not him, having to make that decision and have to live with that the rest of my life and wonder whether there's anybody left down there alive. So this is one of the Israeli torpedo boats circling us. Now, as I said, the air attack lasted to 125, 130. We took the torpedo around 135, 140. After a while, the torpedo boats sort of backed off, but then we threw our last few inflatable life rafts in the water, and the torpedo boats came along and machine gun holes in the life rafts, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention, keeping servicemen from saving their own lives. This is what we call K-shoring. It's the way we kept the ship afloat, which a lot of people can't believe we did manage to keep her afloat. As a matter of fact, I ran into a kid in 2007 who said he went to boot camp and he said they used the Liberty to teach damage control in boot camp. These were like railroad type pieces of timber because internal bulkheads aren't strong enough to withstand all that sea pressure. One of the things they did with me that night after the attack was this is a day or two later, and they'd cleaned it up. They took me up there. It was full of fuel oil, gave me a little one-battery flashlight and said, here, watch this timber and make sure it doesn't give way. So I stood a 4-hour duty up there doing that. So these pictures I took the following morning as the Davis and the Massey came closer and closer. And one of the excuses, well, a number of different things. One of the excuses the Israelis used was that they came out to find the ship that was shelling the shore the day before. And also that they came out, they thought that they had us on radar doing 30 knots. Well, we were a converted World War II cargo ship. The top speed of the Liberty was 18 knots. Then they said they mistook us for an Egyptian ship called the El-Khazir, which is actually, even the Mossad knew at the time, was in dry dock in Alexandria, Egypt, and wasn't even seaworthy. It was a World War I horse carrier that the English built that had been sold to the Egyptians. And it was 1/4 of the displacement of the Liberty, so it wasn't even near the same size. So the other thing is they said they came out to find the ship that was shelling the shore the day before. Now, when I went through PTSD, one night I got confronted with my anger, which was totally impacted the reason for the high blood pressure. And one of the guys that had been a Marine in Vietnam looked at me and said, you know, you guys got screwed as bad, if not worse than anybody I ever knew in Vietnam. He said, you got every right to be as angry as you can be, but he says, I got to tell you, so what are you going to do about it? And I thought, you mean I have to own this too? I had to live through this. I've had to suffer with this for 20 years, and now I've got to be responsible for my own anger. So it took me 4.5 years to come up with an answer for that, and I finally wrote every California and Kansas congressman and senator. They all passed the buck back to my local congressman, who was Rohrabacher at that time. And Rohrabacher asked me to come in, and he sat across his desk and looked at me. I wrote a 3-page letter with 30 pages of documentation. And he said, I've read everything you've written, all the material you sent me. He says, there's no way I believe this was a mistake on the part of the Israelis, but he says, I got to tell you, Congress won't touch this till after there's peace in the Middle East. Well, it'll be in my lifetime. And in my angry letter, in order to get rid of my anger, I said, even a Cub Scout can tell you can't shell a shore 13 miles away with a 50 caliber machine gun. Now, this is the USS Davis. We're doing a highline transfer, which is how you transfer goods between Navy ships at sea. They had a 5-inch gun on their ship. Now, if we'd had a 5-inch gun, maybe we could have shelled the shore. I'm not even sure then, but certainly not with our little stinking 50 caliber machine guns. This is also the next day, and the Davis is sailing alongside of us. These are pictures of guys on the America taking pictures of us. We're in the background. We had this helicopter pilot off the America, and one of my shipmates has a radio show. So we didn't see, as I said, any Americans till in the morning the Davis and the Massey. Then in the afternoon, the America came alongside. And we evacuated the badly wounded. And so this is the helicopter pilot. He couldn't sit down on our forecastle. There wasn't enough room, so he could just get his landing gear down enough for us to put the stretchers on it. And this is him returning to the America. And these are the guys on the America unloading our wounded. Now I'll talk about what was alluded to earlier, Johnson ordering the Sixth Fleet to abandon us. Dave Lewis was my boss. He was the lieutenant commander at the time. He was in charge of all of our intelligence group. Dave also happened to be an academy graduate. And Dave was 10 feet from the torpedo when it went off. He said he looked out of his peripheral vision. He saw the torpedo slide on the other side of a bulkhead. And he said the bulkhead shielded him from the blast. But when the explosion ignited all the paint on the bulkhead, and it flash burned his body. So my watch section supervisor, Billy Snell, who lives in Oregon, saw Dave and pulled him out of there before we closed the hatch. And so the next day when they got Dave over to the America, the doctors had to lance his eyes open because they had been seared shut. They cleaned him up a little, and they said, Admiral Geis wants to see you in his cabin. And Geis told him, Geis was the second-ranking admiral right under the fleet admiral, Admiral Martin. And Geis told him this story, and I'll digress here for a second. Captain Tully was captain of the other aircraft carrier, the Saratoga. Joe Tully had retired in Carmel. Unfortunately, he and Ruth are both dead now, but my wife and I used to go up and take him out to dinner once a year. As a matter of fact, Linda and Ed met us at the sardine factory one time for dinner, and we were going to see Joe the next day. And poor Joe would sit in his living room and look at me and say, I never could understand why my planes were recalled. He said, we got hit at 2 o'clock, got a distress call out at 2:05. He said he had 16 planes, 4 tankers, 12 fighter bombers in the air to come to our aid within 15 minutes of getting our distress call. He said, but before they were out of sight, they were recalled. So Geis told Dave, he said, when Tully put up his planes, I radioed Washington. And he said, next thing told him what Tully had done, and he said, next thing I knew, Secretary of Defense McNamara came on and said, recall the planes. He told Dave, he said, I couldn't believe they were going to abandon you guys. So he said, the only thing I could think of is maybe they thought there were nuclear weapons on those planes. So he said, I told both the America and the Saratoga to bring up older planes from below that could only carry conventional armament. 90 minutes after the attack started, put up a set of planes from each carrier, radioed Washington again. He said, McNamara came on and said, recall the planes again. Told Dave, he said, I still couldn't believe they were going to abandon you guys, so I decided to push it. I asked him to authenticate his message, and for anybody that's been in the Navy, they know that that means, does your boss agree with the orders you're giving me, which is going over his head. And he said, the next thing I knew, Lyndon Johnson came on and said, recall the damn planes. I don't care who dies. I'm not going to embarrass my allies. So these are some of the other guys that were evacuated to the America. I was what they call walking wounded, and so I stayed on the Liberty and went to Malta with her. A couple of days after that, on the America, they got their Marines dressed up and had a memorial service for our 34 dead. So as I said earlier, we sailed the ship for a week across the Mediterranean and put her in dry dock, and it just came into my head, so I want to say it before I forget it, because otherwise I'll probably forget it later, is I've been told that the following day after the attack, either the White House or through the White House, the State Department, sent out telegrams to the 34 families of the dead saying that the mistake or the attack was a mistake. Now, we sailed the ship for a week and put her in dry dock in Malta, and they didn't even start the Board of Inquiry till we got to Malta. So, I mean, how could they be making a statement that it was a mistake when there hadn't even been a court of inquiry yet? So this is when we got to Malta. You can see how we're listing to the starboard side in both photos. Same thing here. That's the tip of the torpedo hole. We're still in the water. Again, tip of the hole. So when they first got there, since it was where I worked and it was all full of classified material, they covered it with this tarp. Then they sent in these 3 Navy divers to inspect what was in there. So here we put her in dry dock. You can see the timber holding the ship up. So this is all torpedo hole. This is the water line. This is that tip you were looking at. This is all torpedo hole, all underwater. To give you a perspective of how big it is, you see that line I drew down with my computer. You see that white hat, that's one of my shipmates standing there. It's a 40-foot hole. As one person told me about a year ago, you could put your house in that hole. So these are pictures inside again. Probably, besides being told to never talk about it, probably the most damaging thing to me, which is why I finally became okay with having a Purple Heart, not because of my wounds as much as my emotional wounds. I have been told from some of the guys that they think that this is me. It is what I was wearing. I was wearing coveralls. I'm not so sure that that was me. I spent 2 days down where the 25 guys were blown apart by the torpedo. All I remember out of those 2 days is about 15, 20 minutes. I found an arm, and I knew whose arm it was. And after that, I just blocked out the rest of those 2 days. Turns out that about 6 years ago, his name was Phil Tiki. About 6 years ago, I found out that I'd gotten a copy of the obituary and that he was buried, that he'd gone to high school at Downey High School. Well, Downey is a town just about 20 miles northwest of where I live in Orange County, although Downey's actually in LA County. And I spent a year battering Downey High School with emails trying to find out something. And finally, one of the teachers finally answered me, and they said, you know, there is another Downey High School in California. It's in Modesto. So I got a hold of the mortuary up there and found out that Phil's buried just south of, in a little town south of Modesto. And so my wife and I, about 6 months before she died, went up and visited his grave. But all of that was part of why I had the impacted anger and everything. As I said early on, where we worked was a forward cargo hole. Well, the torpedo blew away most of the internal walls that separated the rooms that we worked in. So you can see here, this is just a big open area like it would have been when it was a cargo ship, because all our working spaces were gone. So during the 2 days, this is guys on break. This is me. It's not a very clear photo, but if you could see my face, I wasn't a happy camper. Here they were bringing caskets on board. And some of the guys, the 9 guys that died topside during the air attack, we had put in the refrigerator down on the mess decks, so they were unloading them. So after the 2 days, I was probably still on the Liberty for a few days, and then As I said, 2/3 of the 294 guy, it was alluded to 70% of the crew. We had 294 guys, 208 Purple Hearts. 2/3 of us were crypto technicians. They weren't going to need us to do our job anymore. We weren't going to be listening to anybody. So they did keep a few crypto technicians because we had to bag up all our classified material. They kept a few guys to keep watch on the material on the way back to the U.S. So they patched her up and brought her back. I was flown back to Norfolk, and I basically said this earlier, but when I got back to Norfolk, I took 7 planes getting back to Kansas on 30 days leave, and only thing I remember telling my parents was, if I never see another airplane, I'll be happy. And so when I got to Norfolk, they debriefed me. And they, as I had said earlier, they told me, you've got the highest security clearance anybody can get in this country. Go away, never talk about this to anybody, including your family. And unfortunately, I did that. Maybe this is a good place to throw this in. Of the 34 families that of the dead, the Israelis paid $3.25 million. That's a little less than $100,000 a son, which in my view isn't a lot of money. When I was in Hawaii about 6 months or so later, I was notified that I was going to be given the Purple Heart. I also got, about that same time period, I got a letter from the State Department with a check in it for $300. And it said, here's $300 for your wounds. Sign this document that says you agree to never sue the state of Israel. Well, I was such a scared kid at 21, and having that big security clearance, I just wanted it to all go away, so I signed it. I mean, I just wanted to forget it. I wanted to get out of the Navy, go back to the University of Kansas, and try and live a normal life. Unfortunately, I hadn't lived a normal life and ended up sort of screwed up afterwards because of it. So this is the Liberty on the way back. Here you can see they're flying our normal steaming colors, which is a 5 by 8 foot flag, the flag that the Israelis say they couldn't see, even though earlier in the morning they said they had us identified as an American intelligence ship. And as I said earlier, our signalman in the middle of the attack ran up our holiday colors, which is a 7 by 13 foot flag. So, Memorial Day has passed. On Veterans Day, this is when they brought her back to Little Creek, which is, Little Creek's a small naval base just south of Norfolk. Everybody thinks they didn't bring her into Norfolk, our home port, because they didn't want any news coverage. So this is them docking her at Norfolk. One of my shipmates that was a crypto technician that stayed on the Liberty stayed with it, and he said when they got her docked in Little Creek, the guys came down from NSA, and he said they started opening up the classified bags, and he said we started finding fingers and all sorts of stuff in the bags. So on Veterans Day, you can try and remember these 34 guys. I talked about a few of them: Alexander Tomskin, Phil Tiki. Now, this is the end of my original slideshow. Since that time, as I said, I really don't want to get into Middle East politics, but since that time, in order to try and find out what happened to us, I have been involved with a friend of mine who is a retired Jewish oral surgeon who lives in Upland, and he and I have about over 20 Freedom of Information Act requests in. A couple of the things that we have gotten declassified are this document is a CIA document. The second paragraph says that Moshe Dayan, who was in charge of all the Israeli Defense Forces, would be like our Secretary of Defense. When he ordered the attack, it says that his own general told him, this is an American ship, it's pure murder, you shouldn't do it, and he did it anyway. And then he was going to send out another wave to finish us off, and one of his admirals refused to issue the order for a second wave of attack. And this is a declassified NSA document that Dr. Bob and I found. And it's a part of an interview. General Carter was director of the NSA at the time when we were attacked. In the magic marked, yellow marked part, he said he was called before Congress the following day, asked if it was deliberate or not, and he said it couldn't be anything but deliberate. And he said, no sooner was out of my mouth, but what Secretary of State Vance jumped up and said, well, that's premature. In 2004, when my wife and I were coming back from my mother's house in Kansas, we stayed in Taos, New Mexico at a Best Western, and I was walking down the hall with the T-shirt that Jane and Tom have on, and my wife saw this guy looking at the T-shirt, and she looked at him and said, are you interested in that T-shirt? And I heard her, and I turned around and looked at him, and he had a sheepish look on his face, and he said, I got to tell you, I was an officer in the Israeli army in 1967 when you guys were attacked. And I was so impressed he had guts enough to say anything to my face. For all he knew, I might just tear his throat out, and if I hadn't gone through 3 years of PTSD therapy, maybe I would have. And so I told him I always carry a hard copy of my slideshow with me in the car. So we met him and his wife in the bar, and I went through the slideshow with him, and when I got through, he looked at me and he said, I never could understand why the American government spent so much time covering this up. He said, because he said when the Six-Day War was over, Moshe Dayan briefed all the officer cadres an outtake to the war. And when he came to the Liberty, he said, Dayan said, we tried to take out the Liberty because we didn't want them to find out what our plans were. Well, one of the suppositions, which there are a lot more than just one, is that Admiral Moore had always said that that our government had told them we would support them as long as what they did was defensive in nature. The day after they tried to sink us is when they attacked Syria and took the Golan Heights, which obviously wasn't defensive. Moore's supposition always was that they didn't want us to find out what their plans were. And so this Israeli army officer sort of verified that. But anyway, I will answer questions if I can. Yes.